Hello and welcome back to Couples Talk. I'm Jonathan Decker, licensed therapist and co-founder of Mended Light.
I'm Alicia Decker, CEO of Mended Light.
And joining us today once again is Lark Dean Galley, author of Learning to Breathe Again, Choosing to Heal After Losing a Loved One to Suicide.
We just talked a lot about suicide in the last episode. We're going to go into the details of how this has affected your life in multiple ways. But if you haven't seen part one, go back and watch that. Your dad was undiagnosed bipolar. You talked about the insecurity, the instability that brought up in your life, in the life of your siblings. You were the oldest, and you had to pick up a lot of the slack, right? And then you talked about how it affected your relationships as an adult with your husband because of the patterns and the examples that were set for you. And you didn't even realize, oh, this was really an unhealthy way my parents dealt with conflict because of the mental illness.
Well, your father isn't the only time that your life was touched by suicide. Your son Christian also took his life. And I know that's had a tremendous impact on you and a shift in your life mission. And so I look forward to having that conversation with you today because I think there are a lot of people at home who need to hear what you have to say.
So you were an adult when you lost your dad to suicide, and that's like
almost 8 years. Yeah, almost 8 years ago. And it was a breaking moment. The sad part is I knew that at some point he was going to take his life. He talked about it. We had a conversation about it every few months. He would bring it up. He had DNR tattooed on his chest. That stands for Do Not Resuscitate. Wow. Tattooed on his chest. Not that it helped because the paramedics did try to resuscitate him, and I can talk about that in a minute, but he was doing unhealthy, unsafe behaviors. He got an additional life insurance policy out for accidental death and dismemberment for high-risk activities. Yeah. And then he would get his motorcycle, fast motorcycles, and he would go riding through the mountains, like very fast speeds type thing. He never had an accident with that, but if he had died that way, I think that would have been an easy out for him. So you can see this unsafe behavior.
For those watching at home, I want to issue a trigger warning for this episode. This is meant to be healing. This is meant to be helpful, but it is probably going to be quite heavy, and we're going to go right into it. And so if you yourself are contemplating death by suicide, pause this episode. There's a number right here on the screen for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Give someone a call to talk through this. This episode is meant to be very helpful for you or for those who have lost a loved one to suicide. But if you find yourself triggered, it's okay to pause and get some help or engage in some self-care, talk to your therapist, or watch this with a family member. So thank you.
And you're right to say that because, as a child of a parent who took his life by suicide, very angry, right? And as I mentioned in the last episode, I did not realize how his death was going to impact me. 5 months of like in a dark hole, not knowing what I was doing or going through the day. And I look back and I have a dark hole for 5 months. I don't remember that. And so just seeing my father over time, he would try to get help. He would try to find the right medication. It didn't always work. He would go off medication, go on, and then to see his siblings struggle, to see my cousins, and to see several of my brothers and sisters struggle with it.
So when he died by suicide, you talked about going into a dark hole for 6 months, you said?
5 months.
5 months. Mm-hmm. And that there was just a dam of emotion that had been held back for, it sounds like decades, that just broke. I know that people who take their own life very often are in a headspace of everyone will be happier without me. They'll be better off without me. They may be sad for a little bit and then they'll let me go. And this is part of this way of thinking so that they can be free. And what those of us who haven't been there to that place of despair before don't really understand is how outside of mainstream thinking and emotion a person is there.
Yes.
And how miserable and sad and overwhelming it is, and you just want the pain to stop.
Yes.
And a lot of people looking at it from the outside think it's selfishness because they've never experienced it. And so can you speak to being on the family side of things? Mm-hmm. Is the idea that they'll be happier without me, they'll be sad for a little bit, and then they'll be able to move on? Is that true?
No, it's not at all true. Yeah. And I know what you're saying. For those who are contemplating suicide, often it's black or white, all or nothing. And that's really not the way it is. Let's keep looking for ways to find help so that you can feel better. It's not black and white. I look back and I think, wow, what else could we have done? How could I personally have reached out to my father? As I mentioned, because of growing up, the relationship wasn't very close. I was quite frustrated with him and almost feeling like, how can I actually impact him to change his life? I don't even know. He was, a lot of times I didn't even want to talk to him because he was so depressed. Yeah. And he lived in my mother-in-law apartment. And so when we would have holiday gatherings, Christmas, Thanksgiving, a lot of times we hosted and would have my siblings there and the grandkids. And I can remember times where my father would come up to eat. Sometimes he would stay, but a lot of times he would just fill his plate and he would go back downstairs. Yeah. And I see this over and over with people who are isolated or struggling. They isolate themselves, which is exactly the opposite of what you need to do. Yeah. When you're struggling, you need to be with people and you need to interact.
And sometimes putting yourself out there is extremely difficult. So what family members can do, it sounds like, is reach the hand out, extend the invitation, go down and say, hey, come join us. There's a delicate balance, because when a loved one dies by suicide, on the one hand, we can get trapped in self-blame. But the fact is, if someone is truly determined to do it, they're going to find the way. Yes. Is the first thing. The second thing, you're talking about connection. And I talked about a little bit in the last video of what people need. They need a professional when it comes to mental health. Like, family members aren't trained to do that, but they do need connection. They do need community. They do need to not be isolated. And people ask, could I have done more? I mean, I think the answer is always probably yes to some degree, but that doesn't mean that it's your fault, right? But we look at it, and if you know someone who's struggling, it's not your job to fix it. It's not your job to make it go away. It is your job to let them know that you are there for them and that you would be devastated if
they were to take their life.
Can we speak about Christian?
Sure. So Christian is my son. He was 19 when he took his life. And because of my family's history of bipolar, mental illness, I thought I did a good job in watching to see if any of this carried into my children. And apparently I did not do a good enough job, because I did not know that my son was struggling, and he was. I found out later from his friends that he was struggling, and they said, we knew he was struggling, we knew he was talking about suicide, but we didn't take it seriously. Yeah. And I'm like, if somebody talks about it, you should always take it seriously. Right. And then the other thing was,
because people say, well, I just think it's a cry for help, or they're just trying to get attention. And generally speaking, it is a cry for help, and they are trying to get attention, but not in the I'm trying to get attention way, like, somebody please help me. Yes. And yes, I mean, I'm in my field, there are people who play that card and they don't mean it. It's always best to err on the side of caution.
Exactly. Right? So that you'll never have regrets, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the friend said to me after Christian died, I thought about reaching out to you, but I didn't know when would be a good time. And I'm like, as soon as you hear about it, that's a good time, right? Yeah. I looked at that and think, okay, we might have changed things. Now, does that mean he might never have taken his life? No, but it might have meant that we would have been with him a little bit longer and maybe found some answers to help him, or even knew that he was struggling. That would have been helpful. And so I look at that and I think, as a parent, I always thought I was a good parent. I always thought, talk to my kids about underage drinking, premarital sex, all of these things that you warn your kids about, stranger danger, all of these things. And yet I did not know that suicide was the #1 killer of youth in Utah. It's the #2 killer nationwide. I didn't know this, because even though my father had died by suicide, at the time, which it was 5 years before my son died, I couldn't talk about suicide. I couldn't say the word. My best friends didn't know how my father died. And I look back and I think that was my coping mechanism. And then when my son died by suicide, I started to go into that black hole because I was familiar with it from going through it with my father. And I quickly realized two things. The first thing is that I didn't have the luxury of going into a black hole, because my husband and my other kids were struggling. And if I wasn't there fully, they might not be there when I came out of my black hole. Yeah. And the other thing is that parents, my friends, started reaching out to me when my son died, and they had teenagers who knew my son. And the parents expressed concern not only for me, for my son, but also for their kids, because their kids had either attempted or had been considering suicide. And because of their knowing Christian, their concern was a copycat suicide. And so I quickly realized that I had a responsibility to speak out, to help these children, because I couldn't change what had happened with Christian. And while I wanted to sort of hide, my thought was, if I don't talk about it, then I would have a responsibility towards these kids if they did take their life. I can't affect their agency and if they choose to or not, but I can choose whether I speak out or not. And that's what I started to do, and I just started talking about it. And the more I talked about it, the more people came to me and said, I've been struggling, or I attempted. And these were people that I never would have thought were struggling. And that's what I think happens, is when we create a safe space to talk about it, then people can say, I am struggling, I do need help.
Your book is focused on helping people in your position, specifically the family members. Can you tell us why this book?
And that's a very interesting book, because I was planning to write my story, a Christian story basically, right, from my standpoint as his parent. And then as I started writing the book, a friend of mine from high school days said, well, you're going to talk about your childhood, aren't you? And I said, oh, why would I talk about my childhood? You know, I don't want to talk about my childhood. She goes, no, your childhood was crazy. I can remember going to your house and you, as a teenager, were hiding food so that you'd have food the next day. And I thought, I don't remember doing that. And so if you don't remember something, it wasn't abnormal, it was just part of your life. And I thought, well, that's a little bit scary, right? That's what I was doing to survive. And she said, no, you need to talk about the bipolar, the instability of your family. That helped in being able to write that story, because then I could see this pattern happening with my father, and then how I as an adult tried to cope with the instability from my youth. I became even more strict.
Yeah, you were very structured, very
yes,
rigid.
Very rigid.
I mean, because we've been friends for years. I never met Christian, but you talked to me about Christian, and having those personal conversations with you, and then in reading your book, like I can see like all the things you did with your personality type, but also creating structure and stability because you had none, right? And that was your saving grace, right? Was doing
That's
that.
how I coped.
Right, was doing that for yourself, and then raising kids with trying to cope, right, with your structure and stability, and them not having those same needs and not understanding why you have those needs. And while each of our stories is, like, my story is nothing like yours, I can relate to that. Like, I can relate to, here's the challenging thing in my life that happened, and then here's how I coped with it, not even knowing that this is how I coped with it, and then this is the ripple effect those coping mechanisms had. Being in a place where you can be aware of your individual needs, having the awareness, oh, here's what my loved ones' needs are, my spouse, my children, and then how do we meet both of those needs? And it's challenging and it's a struggle, but I love what you said in episode 1. It was just a small moment, but you said, you know, I think we need to give each other grace. And I think that's always the place where we start with ourselves, right? Because so often there's so much internal judgment of, I could have done something different. I could have done something more. How could I not see, you know, that even these were my coping mechanisms and how it affected other people? Like giving ourselves that grace and then turning that outwards towards our loved ones.
And I look at that and say, my father did the best he knew how at the time.
Yeah.
I did the best I knew how at the time. My son did the best he knew how at the time. And being able to allow grace, and that's the one thing I think the blessing from this whole situation with my son is that I'm less judgmental. I'm more apt to give people grace in that, you know, allow them to be wherever they are in their journey.
Well, and people need that. People need acceptance. People grow and change. We often think, well, if I just accept people, then they're not going to get any better. And they're not going to make changes. They just think they're great just the way they are. But the fact is, when people feel respected and loved, my mom used to say, you know, the whole you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. But also I saw plaque one time that said, "Be the man your mom thinks you are." Right? Just the notion of people rise up to the expectations we hold for them. That type of positive reinforcement that comes with, you are good enough as you are enough as you are. You know, being more, learning more, having greater capacity will just bring you more joy, and I want that for you. But you don't need to do it for me to accept you.
And I think as parents, that's exactly our role. Before, I always felt that if my children don't succeed in life and become these wonderful, fabulous people that change the world, then I have failed. And I put a lot of pressure on myself. And now I realize that as a parent, my job is to accept and love them no matter what. No matter what. And I've changed the way I parent from before my son died to now.
Yeah, how so?
So before, it was very strict. We're a military family, and it was like the kids had curfew, and my husband was right there. And if they were 1 minute late, you know, they were grounded for 2 weeks. I mean, he would be there with the clock, watching them, you know, and
wow.
it was very strict. If they did something that maybe I did not think was for their highest and best, they would hear about it, and maybe there would be repercussions, right?
Yeah.
And so there, my adult daughter, she's now 21, but a year ago she joined the military. She's a combat medic. She came home, and shortly after coming home from her basic and her annual training, she had a tattooed on the side of her foot, which normally that would not have gone down. I mean, she's living at home, so it would not have gone down in the Galley household, right? And I looked at that and I just said, well, you know what, honey? You've always loved the mountains. It's, you know, as a picture of the mountains. You've always loved the mountains, and good for you. And I didn't.
I bet she was shocked.
Yeah, she probably was. I didn't even feel like any like pain inside my heart, like, oh my goodness, you know, there's a slippery slope, you know? Yeah. And it's her life. She's going to choose what she's going to do, right?
Yeah.
There's always something worse, and that something worse is suicide, which, you know, we've had this something worse. So at this point, you know, what's a tattoo? And then a few months later, she started sporting a belly ring. And I started laughing, and I'm like, yeah, you know, Mom's thinking of getting one too. And she was like, oh, please, Mom, don't. But it was just one of those things where I could just laugh. And instead of thinking, oh, she's making choices that I might not make, she's doing what she feels good about. And I'm okay with that.
Lark, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And what I find most inspirational is how you showed up in your pain, and you felt that happening this time, and you said, basically, I have a choice, right? Like, I can go into my dark hole, or I can be honest about what I'm experiencing. I can show up and I can support those around me and not minimize your pain, but speak about it honestly and truthfully, and try and support others through that are struggling with similar things or have struggled with the same thing. And I think that's truly an inspiration. So thank you so much for doing that. And for those who've experienced trauma in their lives and need some support, we have a free trauma resource in the description below. Go ahead and click that link. We are here to support you.
Yes, we are. And we have another video we want to direct you to, Trauma and Sexual Abuse Part 1, that you can check out right here. Thank you so much for joining us. Lark has been talking with us about mental health and about death by suicide. And in our conclusion, we're going to talk about the grieving process. So thank you so very much for being with us. And as always, keep shining. We need your light.